Ano'ai ke aloha ya kākou. Thank you for joining us today. In a moment, we will hear from Governor Josh Green about his priorities for the executive supplemental budget for the fiscal biennium of 2023 to 2025. Questions and answers will follow promptly after Governor Green concludes his remarks. Without further ado, it is my great honor and privilege to welcome Governor Josh Green to the podium.
Aloha. Good to see you guys. Okay. Get this lot to prep for today. So I'll get this up here. Okay. Good to see you. Sorry about the multiple days of press conferences, different subjects, different priorities these last couple days. So today we're going to talk about our next budget. Here it is. You've all gotten one of these by now, or will right after this quick session. This is our budget in brief for the supplemental budget. So it's about 140 pages long. It details what the priorities are both now and going forward, also what the plan is to deal with the obvious reality of Maui. And so this is for everyone to share, so we'll have that available. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few slides today. So I'm pleased to submit this budget to the legislature. They'll also get it this afternoon. What you will find in general is it's a structurally sound budget. It maintains our priorities, which are taking care of people. The GAP plan is still included. That's our green affordability plan. This is the next stage of the tax breaks for those who are ALICE families who have been struggling. It, of course, has a significant commitment to Maui and the recovery over the wildfires. And then you will see basically our ongoing commitment to housing, homelessness, and the many priorities that we've laid out. I'll explain how we're able to do that in spite of the fact that we've had a tragedy last year. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so you will see here that what this budget does is it maintains our strong reserves. At the end of this fiscal year, we'll have $827 million on hand. That's our projection. And then the following year, we'll have $755 million on hand. The reason we keep these reserves in place is because if we are fiscally sound, we maintain good bond ratings, we maintain the capacity to borrow money at a lower rate, we maintain a capacity to care for crises and deal with crises. So as you can see, that was very important. So this budget covers our wildfire costs, which we'll dive into. It invests in significant disaster preparedness, which is obviously important in climate adaptation. We have several general funded projects that we have now converted over to bonds from cash. That frees up resources for us to deal with the recovery and spreads out some of these projects over a longer implementation period. But mainly, I do want to recommit ourselves to our priorities in housing, homelessness, healthcare, climate, and education. So this wildfire disaster that we experienced on August 8th showed us more than ever that we have to keep pushing for housing. That's a very important thing. On Maui right now, if we had 3,000 more houses available, we would not be in nearly the dire straits that we are. We wouldn't have to be rushing to convert short-term rentals to long-term rentals. So it's important that everyone know that we're going to keep pushing for housing. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these areas in a second. So let's go to the next slide. This gives you a good look at kind of what the overview is. It's all broken out in this, in the supplemental budget brief. It's important. We've added $326.7 million to this budget. Most of that additional cash that's in the budget expenditure is going to our responsibilities on Maui. That includes housing people. It includes building. It includes just any number of necessary commitments. Remember, we pay about 10% of what overall costs that arise from a crisis. In some cases, we pay 0% for a period of time, like the cleanup, the debris cleanup. That could be a very large expense, 1.2 or 1.5 billion. If we don't do it quickly enough, we then may end up not having 100% reimbursement. So we have to be thoughtful and actually kind of seize this opportunity to fund projects. You'll see other numbers on this slide. Let's go to the far right there. You can see the $2.8 billion, that increase. A lot of that is revenue bonds for infrastructure from the Department of Transportation, a lot of federal monies. Again, I'll break it out more in the coming slides, but we've increased our budget slightly, and we're able to do that because we converted some of those cash projects to bond projects. We didn't have to cut back on any of our priorities, though. Let's go to the next slide. It gives you an idea of what we're funding as far as departments go. This pie-shaped visual shows that our commitments are what they always have been, but we're even further enhancing in our administration some commitments to human services and education. On the far side of that, you see the budget and finance numbers. Those are pretty fixed costs. That's like our retirement funds, health care, just services that the department offers. That's very important to know that we don't have much flexibility there. But then the human services budget, we are kind of a human services administration. We're very focused on mental health care and homelessness. That's where a lot of those monies fall. You can see monies there in transportation and health also, but education continues to be a commitment. That's that bottom gray pie-shaped visual there. So let's go to the next slide. So our state priorities for this year: disaster preparation, fire response, and recovery. We know better than ever that we are going to statewide have to expand our capacity to deal with crises. So that means a lot of appropriations that we haven't seen before, positions that will fight fires, positions that will pre-place equipment, positions that will cut roads for us that we fire escape. But again, that's statewide. That's not just disaster recovery. You'll see climate and environment funds that we need to do, in addition to some of the things that I always talk about: housing and homelessness, healthcare, and education. Now let's break it out for disaster preparedness. Next slide shows, okay, right off the bat, we'll be asking for $20 million in general funds to Hawaiian homelands for fire recovery, preventive measures, and we're going to be building more houses on DHHL, just so you know. They're very fire resistant. That was important, an important reality for us. 2 houses burned out of over 100 in that area, in the burn zone, because they had better roofs, because they had some architecture that was a lot more modern than a lot of the older homes in Lahaina. We're also going to be asking for $17.4 million for DLNR. $7.4 million of that is for wildfire response, prevention, suppression, dealing with grasses that have grown. We also need emergency response equipment. A lot of this needs to be done. Just needs to be done to be safe going forward. As we can see, a disaster like what happened on Maui costs us loved ones, and it can cost billions of dollars of housing. And so prevention is going to be very important in this budget. We also have 20 positions that we're requesting. That's $653,000 in general funds for brush fire mitigation for Haima, like direct brush fire mitigation. When you dive deep into the budget, let's go into the next page, next slide, you'll see monies for disaster care and case management services for those that were displaced. That's to get people into houses, to make sure they get the TANF funds they need. Also bonds to help upcountry Maui. There are funds in this budget to have environmental services, young people planting trees and brush, non-invasive species, obviously, to help us deal with what is just a reality, an environmental reality. And then there's significant revenue bonds for major repairs. We're going to have to reinstall highway facilities. We're going to have to be fixing pipes in Lahaina, in the area. We'll be supporting the county all the way to the end of this. So that's another appropriation. A couple more slides on climate environment. So in this case, you can see we're asking for $7.5 million for DLNR to improve our resources directly for landscaping. That's what I was mentioning before. We're asking for 3 positions, which is not a lot, for Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation Adaptation Commissioners. We think that having expertise will be valuable. We can do it internally, but there are some specialty services and information we'd like to get. We have special fund dollars for solar grants and the Hawaii Green Infrastructure Authority operations, and then millions of dollars for state parks too. A lot of your appropriations are going to be environmental this year. Let's flip over to infrastructure for housing and homelessness. So we're committing ourselves to the Public Housing Authority. As you know, a couple months ago, We approved 10,800 units for the Hawaii Public Housing Authority. We need to keep that going, and we need to charge that forward because we have such housing needs all across the state. Also, some public housing was burned on Maui. It's important to note. $10 million in general obligation bonds for statewide health and safety improvements in those public housing developments. Bonds for UH West Oahu and Kapolei. We're committed to that development. We'd like to see West Oahu build housing as soon as possible, and also Iwalei Kapalama, another bond. This is building on bonds that we've had before. And then finally, some rent supplements to help low-income households to afford rent. It's very important. Let's talk a little bit about healthcare and mental health care. After the COVID era and now the era that includes the Maui wildfires, we really want to make sure we continue to have added services in our state. There was a lot of discussion recently after there was a tragic event at the Hawaii State Hospital where an individual was killed. We are trying to improve that facility and those grounds in general, but it's not just facilities that make the difference, it's also personnel. Dealing with what has happened in society these many years, more drug addiction, self-harm, we need more psychologists and psychiatrists. So we have a request for $20 million in psychiatric inpatient services, $13 million in general funds for locum tenens, that's doctors and nurses that come through part-time, all for the Hawaii State Hospital. This is complementary to what we had this year, which was a very significant success. The legislature approved $10 million last year, if you remember, for loan forgiveness, and then $20 million in the second year, or $30 million. We'll give you the updates next week, but we've had over 1,000 individuals chosen for those loan forgiveness programs. That's the HELP program, the Hawaii Educational Loan Forgiveness Program. That's a game changer right there to get more people into mental health care, into psychology, into social work. But when you're at the state hospital, it takes very advanced care, and so that's why that appropriation's there. We also are appropriating $6.7 million for general services at the Behavioral Health Crisis Center in Iwalei. That's our Iwalei Resource Center in partnership with the county. And then $10.8 million for child and adolescent mental health services. For a long time, we've come up short in delivering mental health care, especially for adolescents. There's very little care on the neighbor islands. Much of that care has to be born here. So that's an important appropriation. And as we come down the stretch, healthcare access, there's vision screening dollars this year. We have a lot of match from the private sector. You can see $4.9 million for early intervention for Family Health Services Division, bonds to repair the state hospitals across our state. HHSC is important to us. It's our safety net on the neighbor islands. And then additional monies to expand UH opportunities to provide and prepare for new healthcare providers. On education, we have a lot of appropriations in the Department of Education. I'll just highlight a few. $64 million for general funds for core services, including food services. We have, unfortunately, a lot of children that are hungry in our state. Surprising number compared to other states, so we need to do much better there. There'll be special ed increases. This comes on the tail of the contract, though, that increased our revenue and expenditures for teachers. We wanted to make sure teachers, public school teachers, were well compensated. We increased by about 20% over time their compensation, so we keep them. That's very important. But here you also see some more behavioral analysts. That's psychological services on the public school grounds. General funds for safety. We're very aware of what's going on in the mainland. We want to make sure that we do all that we can to prevent any violence at our schools. And then finally, we're restoring some monies to the University of Hawaii to pre-pandemic levels. What do you expect from us for the next year? So the key things that you'll see me talk about once the legislature comes back, again, we're talking about the key fire recovery items. That's very important. We're going to establish a fire marshal. What we would like to share right now is we do anticipate it will be a confirmable position. So we want to work with the legislature on that. We also will have the new phases of the Green Affordability Plan. And that Green Affordability Plan, we did phase 1, lowering taxes on Alice families. Phases 2 and 3 will come next. That piece is keeping up with the cost of inflation. So we index to inflation people's taxes. Otherwise, it's an implicit raise every year. And also, we will have a tax credit of about $38 million to families who have need for services for their children or dependent adults, the child dependent tax credit. So we're going to still fight for that. And then finally, the impact fees that we've talked about. It would have been ideal if we passed them before we had that fire disaster. We proposed that right out of the gate. I still think that we have to do that. We have to have a steady stream of resources to deal with fires and to deal with potential other disasters. I still feel the best approach would be to have some of the visitors that we get pay a portion of this, and so we'll continue to debate whether it should be the TAT, whether it should be a part of our global recovery plan, where there will be legislation, or whether it should come on in the form of a tax on short-term rentals and other high-cost items that should be contributing more to our solutions. So at this point, I basically want to just say mahalo to all of you, and I'm going to be available for questions with my budget and finance director. But if I was to sum up what this budget is, this supplemental budget is, we took to heart our need to care for those who lost everything on Maui. We're going to make them whole. We're going to help them survive. We're going to also keep all of our priorities on Oahu, and what we did is we right-fitted our budget. As you know, last July, I line item vetoed $1 billion, and we didn't anticipate that a month later we would have this disaster, but we knew we had to be somewhat prudent with resources because things always do come up. In this case, it was a disaster on one of our neighbor islands, and it's difficult to predict what will come next. We anticipate good revenues going forward. The early signs are is we're going to have a good budget and good revenues going forward each year, but we can't take that for granted. So we're going to keep our priorities. We're going to keep focus on housing. We're going to solve homelessness over the course of a long period of time, decrease it by half in 4 years if we can, and make sure people have health care. Thank you very much.
Mahalo, Governor Green. Now I would like to open up to questions from the media. Excuse me, I will repeat the question before inviting Governor to respond. With that, we can start with Max.
Yes, Governor, if you could talk a little bit more about the unforeseen impacts from the Maui fires and maybe some of the areas that had to have some of the budget pulled out of, maybe specific projects, departments that you could talk about.
So the question is around seeking clarity regarding the Maui wildfires as it relates to the budget.
Yeah. So I'll start it off, and then and I'll let or I'll ask our Budget and Finance Director, Lewis, to chime in. So we are anticipating over time, expenditures of up to $500 million for the disaster, keeping in mind that the impact will be greater than $5 billion, but we pay usually just a fraction of that because we're supported by the federal government. We already have set aside $286 million to support the Major Disaster Fund. That's important because we have costs that come in a rolling fashion, whether it's housing, rebuilding infrastructure. There will be some settlement needs. So that is obviously the financial impact. Now, the human impact was much greater, and it's going to take time for people to bounce back. So a lot of jobs were lost. We have about 5,000 people still on unemployment. We are seeing recovery advance a little more quickly than we anticipated on Maui, but travel to that island is going to still be slow for some time. So it will have a slight impact on our bottom line. In other words, TAT revenues are going to be down, though we're seeing other revenues up. We're seeing people's tax revenues come in higher, and same with the GET. We can go over those numbers with you in a minute. But when we talk about how we're restructuring the budget, I'm going to defer to Budget and Finance Director because he can explain how we moved some of our monies from projects that were cash bonds into other forms.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Max. It's a good question. We did not stop anything that wasn't already in the budget. We made some adjustments within the state's operating budget for FY24 in order to move projects that were previously cash funded into GO. So nothing was actually stopped when it comes to projects that were previously appropriated by the legislature. It did require us, the events of 8/8 did require us to create more liquidity in the financial plan, primarily because we needed to make sure that we had cash available in order to cover these upcoming invoices and costs that we're going to be incurring because of the Lahaina wildfires. But as we're going into the supplemental budget, and as you can see in the budget and brief that was provided, we did make significant conversions of projects that were appropriated in 24 that you will now see in 25.
There's one thing I should have mentioned earlier, I had intended to mention. This budget does not rely on any of our rainy day funds. So we still are leaving that fully intact at $1.5 billion. It remains to be seen what our costs are going forward, but that is important. And just 2 weeks ago, Lewis and his team did an excellent job in New York seeking new bond buys. And we ended up having, I believe it was $2.5 billion of offers? Of orders for ultimately what was just under $1 billion of bonds. So the reason we still are a very sought after market is because we have a good balance at the end of each year. As I mentioned, 827 million projected and 755. We always want to stay above 500 million at the end of each year. And then when you add that to the $1.5 billion of rainy day, we keep that cushion intact so that we get the best rates possible, so we spend much less on interest. It's, in general, good policy. Of course, if you have to spend the money, you spend it on people who need it. But we're trying to make sure we have the right priorities and we use monies at the right time so we don't dip below any of those thresholds.
Next question, Kevin.
Follow up on that last question. Traditionally, the governors have imposed restrictions on departments, 5%, sometimes 10%. And I'm curious as to whether you had to do that this year, and if it's across the board, and what years and how much.
So the question from Kevin is seeking clarity. Historically, governors have restricted the budget X%. And so the question is whether or not Governor Green is doing that. Mahalo.
I'll toss in a couple comments and Lucy. So we're at 5% restrictions hard and 5% discretionary. So you want to unpack that a little bit? Sure. Okay.
And thanks, Kevin. That's not anything new. We do that every year primarily to manage the financial plan. Departments, as the year progresses, depending on how revenues do come in, they will ask for release of restrictions if possible. But it is something that we do from a financial management perspective because we just want to make sure that we're appropriately allotting departments their budget, but we're keeping some aside just for unforeseen circumstances. So we're not increasing any of the previous restrictions that were already included. So again, that's not anything new that we don't currently do in any year.
Could you just follow up on this? Could you clarify what the governor just said, 5%?
Yeah. So we break it out into two. So we have this 5% hard restrictions that we say, okay, there's 5%. And then we do this other 5%, which is discretionary. Normally what departments will do as the year progresses, they'll ask for, depending on whether or not revenues or the Council on Revenues or revenue projections meet up with expectations, we will go ahead and release the 5% discretionary restriction that's happened so that departments can finish out the year. But normally we try to hold 5% back just in case unforeseens happen, any kind of major change in projections, any type of event that would require us to basically make liquidity available in the financial plan.
And is there a dollar value to that? And you say X number of dollars? Anybody know?
Right now, I don't have that number, but these are restrictions not on everything. So there are certain things that we don't take restrictions on, like, non-discretionary expenses within departments. Obviously, you don't make restrictions for things like, healthcare benefits or debt service. So it's not for the entire budget for the state. It's only for those items that are identified as discretionary when the budget starts.
Thank you.
Hold real quick. I'm going to take a texted question in from Daryl Huff with Hawaii News Now. Will middle-class residents see any tax relief?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, yes, we hope that middle-class residents will. People that are now often described as Alice families, which is 42% of our state, 60% of all of our Hawaiian community, they are working middle-class people now. And so we are projecting $38 million of added tax breaks for individuals that have children that are getting care, preschool care and so on, and also dependent adults. So there's money there. And also by indexing our tax brackets to inflation, we will actually begin to track better with reality as far as earnings and taxes, and that should help everybody in the middle class. So this is adding to what was the first, about 40% of the tax breaks that we had wanted in our first year. We had asked for about $250 million of tax breaks. We only got about $100 million in the first session. I think people were feeling their way into the year and the administration. But that is important. It's important because housing costs continue to be so high. I would say this, I know that Daryl didn't ask this specifically, but housing costs are still the biggest driver for all of us as far as affordability goes. And so though we've approved some housing, we really need to approve a lot more. We're not going to see a big change in affordability until we either get a lot of new houses built or, and this has become an emerging clear issue, we move some of the short-term rentals to long-term rentals and increase the inventory. So expect us to do that with the same kind of energy that we fought for the tax breaks, because that would help a lot of people.
Dan?
I want to follow up with the short-term rental topic you just mentioned. Last week, Bob sent a letter out to owners, 15,000 rooms, and then you told us on Saturday you were going to meet with some of the families of victims about the fund. I'm wondering if there's been any movement on either short-term rentals since your nuclear hammer comment. Getting families to opt out of lawsuits and take 1.5.
Dan's question had a bunch of context, but for those viewing via live stream, the question is simply just around getting more clarity about the short-term rentals, any updates from the governor.
Owners to say they're going to
Getting to the 3,000 units needed.
No, I appreciate that, and we're going to keep giving people updates. So first, it was touching to be with the families who lost a loved one. We're with about 20 more families on Saturday, and I'm going to keep doing those meetings so that they know that we're there for them and that we have some options for them. Whatever they choose, I've said this to the families repeatedly, whatever their choice is, it'll be right. So that's regarding the settlement. To reiterate what I said last week, we're going to offer $1.5 million to each of the families that lost a loved one if they want it. It would be expedited starting on February 1st, and we have in place now an administrator, a bank, and the structure of kind of the process, the protocol. So just shared that with people, and we'll see if that is proper or good for them. That's important. Now on the housing side, they did receive the 13,000 letters. One thing did happen since the press conference we had Friday, which was the council, and I want to give special credit to the council members on Maui. I really appreciate that thoughtful work they did with the mayor. They did pass the tax break, so the property tax exemption for people that transition from short-term rentals to long-term rentals. So that should decrease their costs, short-term rental owners' costs, by thousands of dollars every month, because they won't be paying property tax for 18 months at least. That should move some people over. Also, as you know, FEMA and our Department of Human Services are going to, quote unquote, make whole those who switch over. So whatever they received the previous year, we're going to try to give them an offer that approximates that, a reasonable offer at the short-term rental rate, so we can quickly move these houses into the long-term pool. They're going to be having a workshop for all of those who would be interested on the 21st on Maui. So we'll see what the effects of that letter was. The letter was dated actually the 7th of December, and it went out, I guess, that next day. So now everyone is aware that this offer is there. It's a standing offer. I'm imploring 3,000 owners of short-term rentals, wherever they may be, across our country, here in the islands, on Maui especially, please rent to individuals that lost their homes. Please let us subsidize that cost for the next 2 years so that people can have a stable, safe space to live in while we build housing. It's really important. You're going to get as much resource as you would have otherwise, and we'll begin to work through some of the long-term changes that we might have to make to the short-term rental industry. So that's a big date. We have a website which we'll give you. It's on that letter that was shared that FEMA is pushing, and we'll give more updates as we go.
Can I follow up on that? Sure. You talked about
there's a concept which the mayor shared with me, and that concept is it should offset at least the tax breaks that people get for converting. In other words, if $50 million of tax breaks are given to individuals who change from short-term rentals to long-term rentals, the idea would be to at least make up that amount of money, because Maui's going to need resources. I'll remind people that the short-term rental circumstance is this. If someone has a regular house and they're renting it to a local family for $4,000, they're getting $4,000, they're paying their taxes. The house right next door, if they're an Airbnb, is getting about $14,000 a month, 350 to 360% of what the regular rental is. So it's really skewing the housing market so much that we can barely get people into housing. And we are going to have to rely on people's best intentions. In this particular case, because it's an emergency, we're going to do what we have to get those short-term rentals moved over. But over the long haul, we should provide changes in the tax code so that it evens things out somewhat. It's just too much in the way of a force against local owners. And I would suspect that you're going to see a lot of legislation and proposals this coming year here on Oahu, because it's gotten out of control. We just have too many short-term rentals in our state with too much housing need.
Audrey, I'll get to you. I'm going to go to Chad first.
It's a follow-up to what Dan brought
Okay.
up, Governor, the Victims Fund. The One Ohana Initiative is the same thing, right? Yeah. You talked on Friday about how more people are signing on, Hawaiian Telecom, how you really hope a lot of people would take advantage of that 1.5 million per victim.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still not clear. We're looking at, in theory, about $150 million for this fund. How much is the state of Hawaii going to kick into that fund? I believe Hawaiian Electric, about $75 million, but do we have more precise numbers about that initiative?
So the question from Chad is around the state's share into the One Ohana initiative.
I'll break it out, yeah. So, and let me do a little clarifying, and I'll give you a straight answer. Okay, so One Ohana is the overarching initiative, okay? And that's going to be built into phases. Phase one is for the victims, for the families that had a fire victim that lost their life or was severely injured, okay? So that's the 100 individuals. And then also under the One Ohana initiative is next going to be resources that we'll raise statewide to help with some settlements for lost houses and damage to property and lost business revenues. Okay, so there's going to be multiple phases of this. Okay, so we're at 162.5 million right now, already committed. Yes, HECO has committed $75 million. I've committed $60 million. Which is built into our budget plan under the major disaster funds. Then we have a commitment for no less than $15 million from Kamehameha Schools, $10 million from the county, $2.5 million currently from Hawaiian Tel, and we are still seeking input from others. So we will see if we get other partners. Have also, now we move to the global, approach. Those are individuals that are involved in litigation, have been named in suits, feel a sense of urgency to be responsible for the losses. The broader fund, we expect a lot of other people to come to the table to help us with. This is, for instance, like members of the HEC, other councils where they have multiple members. Some include banks and other large businesses that just want to help. Some have land, some have resources like planning, some have engineers, some will have money, philanthropists, and those will come in next. But I didn't want to mix the two. I just wanted to help that be clear.
Did I hear you say you have 162 million, of which 60 million currently is the state?
Correct.
Which is factored into this budget, is that right?
Yes.
If it's 150 million, does that mean this surplus, if you will then go to the second phase?
That remains to be seen. So of the 162.5 million, that would be completely consumed if we have a lot of individuals opting in to the settlement. I would be very surprised if everyone did. In fact, a significant percentage of people might wait. They might litigate, though it will take several years. So that's up to individual families. I respect them no matter what they choose. The leftover money would likely go back to the parties in a proportion. because it's important that we recognize that phase one was really specific to people who lost a loved one or who were hurt. And then the next phase, as described, is separate in some ways from that. It's some insurance questions and so on. So they have to be a little careful.
I see, as you say, that's the February 1st.
So February 1st start date for people to get in. It'll be at least open for 60 days, longer if necessary. But I think people will know by then whether this suits them or not. And if they, are suited to a settlement, then we'll just expedite it for them. Yeah, you bet.
I'm down to last two questions. I'll take Audrey.
I wonder if you can elaborate on the 20 positions set aside for the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency that are supposed to deal with wildfire mitigation.
Okay, the question is around detailing the 20 positions set aside for HAIMA for wildfire mitigation.
Do you want to come here? I'll let.
Thank you for the question. The details of which you will see, it's included in the operational budget. It's in the Department of Defense section. But these were positions that were requested by Hawaii Emergency Management Agency in order to address not just the situation on Maui, but throughout the state. So it is a statewide initiative that they're doing in order to address these things. So it's, again, these are positions that are supposed to be helping with fire breaks, doing assessments, doing all of the things in order to make sure that the state is well prepared in the event that another situation like this, in order to prevent a situation like what just happened.
Yeah, sure.
Is there any money for firefighters, new firefighters that you're bringing on, or is the money for you?
There is money for firefighters within the Department of Transportation, but firefighters normally are a county function, and those are handled by again, the Maui County, City and County of Honolulu, and that. But there are costs associated for firefighting within the Department of Transportation, specifically in the areas like the airports, which the Department of Transportation Director has in the past made those positions available in order to help combat fires when they do arise. So again, there is some stuff that the state does do, but primarily the handling of firefighter response is done at the county level. In addition to that, there are also firefighters within the Department of Land and Natural Resources, which we are providing resources for in the upcoming budget.
Yeah, I can elaborate from memory, I think, a little bit. I think $10 million to some of the infrastructure. Though it wasn't part of today's presentation because it was already kind of mentioned before, I think we have $16 million a year for helicopters to enhance our capacity to transport individuals that are injured from around the state, neighbor islands and rural parts of Oahu to facilities here. So we decided that a while back because of the circumstance with the Hawaii Life Flight that went down last December. So there's a lot of movement on this. One of the reasons I want to have a climate impact fund is because I want to raise tens of millions of dollars every year so that we can help the counties much, much more when they deal with these kind of fires and hurricanes and tsunamis and volcanic eruptions and whatever else we come up with.
Kevin, you have, okay, go ahead.
If I can, just to follow up on that comment, Governor, how much of a revenue stream do you feel you need from this, what's been called the green fee, right, the climate impact fee?
So the question is, how much of a revenue stream does the governor think he needs from annually?
I would like no less than $50 million a year, and I'd prefer much more. The reason for that is it's not just meant, though it will be best used probably on mitigating fires in the future, dealing with the environmental concerns that we have, helping with fire breaks, but we also are going to see a steep increase in insurance costs across our state, and that's for both commercial property and for people's homes. It's going to be hard for people to afford that insurance if it's not subsidized, and I think that we're going to need to use these climate impact fees to help with that. So we've talked a little bit about that before. You'll see legislation, specific legislation to this effect. Watch out for a couple bills so you can see where this is tracking. There'll be a pure climate impact fee bill. There'll also be a bill that is called securitization. That's to deal with what happened with the fire and how we find resources going forward. That deals with HECO and any other energy companies that would be in our state. But that might also be a place where we look at costs and find out whether we can take monies in a sensible way and put it towards prevention. So these are the big pieces of legislation that we'll have to look at. And then there is going to be discussion about whether or not to raise the TAT tax or not. I know that that can be controversial, but monies that come in from travelers, I favor, because the impact is from that 10 million travelers to our state. And we have to keep them safe just like we have to keep our own people safe.
Can I just get a clarification real quick? So the $50 million a year would be used for both various different types of mitigation programs?
Yep.
And also a subsidy for insurance? Or are you looking at another revenue subsidy for insurance? Or
It would be
how does that work?
same for now. I mean, it's $50 million minimum for what we need. And frankly, we have a lot of catching up to do as far as developing more positions like were mentioned. We need to update our fire trucks. We need to update our water systems. We need to update, we have to create this department for the fire marshal. That's going to be several positions, which is in the budget. And we're also looking at, like I said, tens of millions of extra dollars to keep our insurance market liquid. That could be actually a driving force to pass this. I think that a lot of people are worried that an already expensive housing market could skyrocket upward if we're not careful. We would not be able to sell housing if we can't insure housing. And that's a very significant challenge that we could face. So usually it takes a couple of years for those insurance rates to drop again. And then you have to knock wood and hope that there hasn't been another tragedy or another event. We can't just leave that to chance. So that's why you'll hear me talking about captive insurance markets and subsidies for reinsurance for our state to keep that affordable for us.
This is just a final sort of detailed question, Governor, and then we can open for your closing remarks, which is related to the climate mitigation fee from Daryl Huff at Hawaii News Now. Where would the money come from? Who would pay into it? STRs, your preference? ?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I'm really open to funds from any source, particularly those who travel to the state. We're seeing a movement across the globe in this way. We already saw small countries like Palau do this, and it was very effective. They charge now $100 per visitor. I know that there's been discussion about how difficult it might be to collect that. I really don't see that as a problem, but we have to be constitutional. So there's two at least clear places we could look to revenue. There should be more revenue from short-term rentals. Bless you. It would have the same effect if we tax short-term rentals more and use those monies to help us with housing and use it for climate mitigation. It will both incent people to move towards long-term rentals, which we need the housing, and we'd have the money. So that is one idea that I had last week with some of our colleagues. And the other one is just a straight increase in the TAT tax. The benefit of doing that is it would curb the number of total travelers, which has been something that I've heard from our citizens loud and clear, that they would like to not see us continue to step up, beyond 10 million visitors. It would likely decrease the total number of visitors, but increase the amount of revenue overall. And so we're trying to get a win-win for our state. We do need revenues from other streams because raising any taxes that are regressive would be too much to bear right now, given how expensive it is to just find a rental, pay for our kids' education, even pay for food or water, which we're seeing increases in cost. So I'm being very mindful of that. This is the year to do something meaningful, and I think if we take to heart what happened on Maui, a few people should object. So I welcome input from across the state on what mechanism they'd like to see this money come from. Okay, so just a couple final comments. This will be our first crack at a budget from our team. Because, as you know, we came into office in December and most of the budget was already created, and we appreciate the previous administration's efforts. We obviously have been, heartsick over the loss on Maui, and so we're going to live up to that commitment completely. But we know that there are so many priorities that people all across the state really need us to stare down. And so we're going to continue on with our housing priorities, our homeless priorities. You're going to see a lot of strong moves on healthcare, and we're going to be very mindful of the impact on people's mental health, where it's been quite tough. So that'll be mostly where our appropriations are going, but expect some innovative solutions because, like the climate impact fee and like taxes that drop for people who are in this Alice family category. It'll be just very healthy for us as a people going forward. Happy to give people more updates in January, of course, when we do the State of the State, but we wanted to get you this information to chew on over the holidays. We really want people to know that Hawaii is going to be for our local families, and we're going to do everything possible to help them to live a quality life here. Aloha.